Athletes, take your mark, get set. It's time for the Addict to Athlete podcast. Hey, everybody out there, Coach Blue Robinson here. I want to thank you all so much for downloading, sharing, and subscribing to the podcast. We greatly appreciate you doing so. Hey, thanks so much for everyone this year who has participated in our Project ELF. This is Addict to Athlete Sub for Santa project. And last night we had an amazing evening with folks coming from all over to come collect their presents and gifts for families that struggled this year. And so thank you so much for everyone who's donated, contributed, and for all the elves last night that come and helped wrap, because man, we did it. So thank you so much. And I want everyone who contributed to feel that energy on Christmas Day, that your efforts have blessed the lives of so many individuals, that really were struggling this year. So thank you. One more item of business, check out our website, addicttoathlete.org. We have all of our meetings, all of our content that is free for you to browse to understand more about what Team Addict to Athlete does, our principles and messages, and a lot of content there that'll help you get on that platform and that path of sobriety. Well, athletes, today we got some great guests coming on board, and I was excited to meet these guys when we went out to the Uintah Basin to open another chapter of Team Addict to Athlete. This makes two chapters out there in the Vernal Roosevelt area. We have one in Vernal with Coach Johnson, and we were just able to open up a new Addict to Athlete chapter on the Ute Reservation with Coach Jonah out there, and we feel so lucky to have been invited into that space for the simple fact of everyone who comes on board understands the principles that it takes a team to establish sobriety. So we're happy to have Stephen Mackenzie come on board, who is the prosecuting attorney out there with Wilson Myers. And Wilson, you are the tribal public defender out there. So, gentlemen, as we get rolling with this, it was good to meet you, Wilson, when we were out there. I have questions for both of you, because you guys have an insight and I think a mind's eye on something that even I as a therapist and coach don't get to see, which is typically when people get in situations where there's a consequence that comes along with some of the actions and behaviors. It's a scary time and situation. And I'd love to get both of your guys' thoughts. And Wilson, we'll start with you first, just about why even this career? Because you have a career by which it taxes a lot of emotions, because there's heavy things that are attached to this. So when you get introduced to these people who need help, it's sometimes probably difficult to really navigate even your own thoughts and feelings on people that really need a platform for, we'll call it redemption, and to some points accountability. Wilson, welcome to the podcast. Stephen, welcome to the podcast. Wilson, let's start with you. What got you into this world of defense, and why a passion with it?
No, that's a great question. I've been a defense lawyer now for about 40 years. I've served mostly in Alabama, but I've also been overseas in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I've always determined that a person's potential and a person's worth is far more than what their current situation may be. A person does not start using drugs intending to go to jail, but there are consequences to a person's possession of drugs.
Yeah.
And I've always found that a person, they didn't wake up in the morning wanting to be a drug addict, but they get hooked, they get addicted, and then they can't really stop. And then at some point, law enforcement gets involved, and a person is arrested, and they become part of the judicial system. And that is a tough road to go.
Oh, yeah.
And so I'm just happy to occasionally be able to help somebody understand their consequences. I protect their due process rights, but still they have consequences for what they've done. But my job is to both minimize them if I can and work them through the system the best way possible, protecting their due process.
I love that. I love that. And Stephen, welcome, brother. It's good to have you on here. Thanks so much for joining us. Tell the listeners a little bit about your mind's eye to some of this stuff too, because again, there are consequences, and through those consequences can come accountability, and through accountability can come some of that reestablishment of integrity. But you're probably not always like on a line where they see that right away. What keeps you kind of like in that mind's eye of like, it's going to hurt a little bit, but if you apply the right principles, we'll get you through this. You've got to just do your part. Like, tell me a little bit about you and how you see all this.
Okay. Well, I'm working as a prosecutor now, and I was a prosecutor also a few years ago on the Wind River Reservation, but I have a fairly substantial background in criminal defense as well.
Mm,
So I can see both sides of the equation.
beautiful.
And I do believe that drug addiction is a disease, not a crime, primarily.
Mm,
Um, we have laws on the books that are what they are, but my goal as a prosecutor is to try to ensure that whatever happened to get this person in trouble doesn't happen again.
mm,
Um, just locking them up it does no good. My philosophy isn't that okay, you broke the law, you're going to jail.
yeah.
Um, some people have to go to jail because either they're not willing to work with the system to try to improve their lot and accept and work with the resources that we try to provide for them to um, address their addiction. Uh, and there's also a deterrent component. Other people
Yeah.
need to see that, yeah, there's going to be a consequence if I keep doing this. Um, um, but I do try very hard to look at each situation individually and craft a sentence that fits this defendant, um, rather than just simply look at the sentence available and say, okay, this is how long I want this person to go to jail. There's more to
Mm-hmm.
it.
Part of my job is to see those alternatives to jail or prison, especially rehabilitation. And even
Yeah.
when I was in Alabama, if I can present to the prosecutor a plan to get this person off drugs and
Yeah.
no longer addicted, if there's a way forward that does not include jail or prison, my job is to create that environment and present it forward. That's why Addict to Athletes is so valuable, and other types of programs like that. But Steve is right. He does not look for ways to put people in jail. He looks for
Ah.
ways to help them get off drugs, and so do I. So
See?
Steve is a great prosecutor.
That's incredible to hear that too, because there are so many people out there that would maybe I find that hard to believe, but I've seen it and it's true. And listeners, this is why I'm so happy that they're both on here, because you're going to get two perspectives that have the same theme. Is that in order to make things right too, there has to be that accountability part, and sometimes that's so hard. I'm curious on a level, you guys have seen, like, your careers didn't just start yesterday. You've seen ebbs and flows, and you've seen increases of criminality slash like laws being changed. I've seen over the last maybe 20 years of my own career just helping people in addiction recovery, and I pick up where they start with law enforcement, they come to you, and then they come to me. So it's kind of like this golden thread. How have you guys seen that golden thread maybe get a little stronger and a little bit more tight? And what do you both think we need to do as a society, as a state, maybe as a government, to help people understand that, like, this is the path to redemption, not just a consequence for behavior? Stephen, let's start with you, if you don't mind. What have you noticed? Does that golden thread exist?
It's getting there.
Okay.
There still aren't enough resources for rehabilitation to meet the needs of everybody out there. Um, and rehabilitation may not work the first time. The
Mm-hmm.
first time someone goes to a program, they may well relapse. Most do until they've been through the ringer a few times. It just happens. And when I was a defense attorney, I would get so frustrated with prosecutors who simply looked at it as a crime and didn't factor in the concept that it's a disease, not a crime.
Yeah.
Um, now, a lot of people, um, probably a high percentage of people who use, graduate to selling to support their habit.
Yes.
That's when it gets a lot more dangerous, and that's when jail time and sometimes significant jail time comes into the picture.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Non drug offenses caused by drugs are a real problem for people accused of non-drug offenses. Theft, robbery, assault and battery, they could all be caused by drugs, but the crime itself is not a drug crime.
Mm-hmm.
Many judges, many judicial systems, and Steve can comment on this, are creating things called drug courts,
Mm-hmm.
where a person who is a user
Yeah.
and has not committed a violent offense as a result of their drug use can enter a program which I commonly refer to as drug court, sometimes wellness courts. The the judicial system recognizes that there's a better way forward than simple incarceration.
Yeah.
And you're seeing drug courts over the last 15, 20 years become prevalent. And that's great because the drugs that people are faced with now are so much worse than they were 15 or 20 years ago.
Mm.
We need more help.
So
People
then,
need more.
with some of this stuff that you guys are noticing, I'm curious. I want to drill down on a few factors. Wilson, what do you see that's starting to go really, really right, really good? And then, Stephen, what are you noticing that still needs some work? Like, I'm curious. I want some ebb and some flow with this because we're the ones that fill the voids. So what are you noticing that's going well, and what do you know that's not going so hot?
I'm noticing that society, a person's family, a person's circle is impacted by the drug use just like the person is.
Yeah.
And so there seems to be a better attitude now toward drug treatment and drug rehabilitation than there was, say, 15 or 20 years ago. And programs like yours, like Addicts to Athletes, is a great example of how society is stepping up looking for alternatives to incarceration.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Stephen,
what do you think?
On that point, I do tend to agree. I think we've got a long way to go to change attitudes along those lines. And on the flip side, though, one of the things that I'm seeing is a marked increase in methamphetamine use, and that is a real problem. And I do take a very serious approach to meth. Someone's caught with a small amount, first or second time, my focus is still on getting them rehab and help. But if it's a saleable quantity, they're looking at a fairly serious jail sentence. That drug the damage that drug does to not only the individual but to the society they live in is huge.
Yeah, it used to be just pot or just cocaine, either crack or. But now with fentanyl, with other designer drugs coming into the market, it gets to be much worse. And so I understand the prosecution's desire to get meth off the street because meth is a addictive, terrible animal. Meth is.
Yeah, absolutely.
It just destroys a person.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Their teeth fall out. I mean, it's a horrible drug.
It is. And I would say, listeners, I want you guys to hear what they're saying too, because again, they're not trying to hurt or even incarcerate you as much as they're saying, hey, this drug problem is creating all that nonsense and problems within you. And so, when I hear you guys saying, yeah, these are the things I know that we're doing well and the things we need to work on, I know that there's times when you take a lot of this, I would say, case by case as well. Like when this stuff starts to come down, and Wilson, you being on that side of like, hey, let's get you some help. Are they resistant to that at first? Like, you're not really here. We're just going through the process. At what point do they start to understand that, look, guys, let's listen, let's feel this, let's get to know, because again, they're in the mindset of I can't trust anybody, right? Like everyone's out to get me.
No, and the paranoia that's caused by meth and other drugs is part of that problem.
Mm-hmm.
But when they're in court and the judge looks at them from the bench and says, you're going to jail or you're going to rehab, what's your choice? Then they really seriously understand that they have an option. And it is their choice.
Yeah.
They can either choose to keep using drugs and be in jail ruin their life, or they can choose rehabilitation, which most judges and most prosecutors will go along with if there's a genuine program and a real plan. Um, Jail sometimes dries people out, but I've seen so many times the moment somebody gets out of jail, they go right back to using it again.
Stephen, how does that flow across your mind's eye? Because you have a very intense position as well as a prosecutor. It's like I'm going to uphold the law, but you also see the human side in this too. And so I know that there's those things where people say, "Well, yeah, that prosecutor just threw the book at me." They're not seeing the whole picture, are they? How hard is it for you at times to kind of like say, "Hey, you need to understand that the personal side of this is we want you to get help, but the legal side of this is you have to be accountable." How hard is that to balance in a situation like that?
That's one of the hardest parts of the job. Um, and I think in part is because of my background as a criminal defense lawyer and public
Mm-hmm.
defender. Um, I
Mm.
have probably 15 years working in that side of things.
Wow.
Um, so I've worked with people who, some of them want to get help, and that's the real key, is that they've got to hit that point where they really want to get help. Some of them just BS me to try to avoid going to jail.
Yeah.
uh, and if it's simple possession, they're not likely to get a very significant jail sentence. It's the trafficking sales that really
Yeah.
get somebody jammed up, and as it should be.
Yeah.
um, if somebody's selling, even if it's to support their habit, I'm going to look for a jail sentence to get their attention. Um,
Mm-hmm.
if it's just use, we'll focus on. I'll try to focus on rehab unless they just become incorrigible, and it's clear that they want to keep using, and they're going to no matter what, meaning they've bombed out of rehab several times, and then we just need to, the law kicks in. They're going to have to serve a sentence, whatever that may be.
Mm-hmm.
um, and I, I have, when as a public defender, I would see the same people coming back over and over again.
Those continue, Stephen. Sorry, you'd see them keep coming back, and would they have different excuses, or would they be like, I know, I'm sorry." Like that's got to be heartbreaking.
Well,
Yeah, go ahead, Wilson.
okay, there are lots of excuses that people have. I've got pressures at home. I've got
Yeah.
pressures in marriage. Things aren't going well at work. I need to escape for a while. But there's no excuse to using illegal drugs. There's
Mm-hmm.
counseling available to help people. I'm not advocating alcohol use, but that's at least legal. Uh,
Yeah. I hear
Alcohol
you.
use is also a drug. But if a person genuinely hits bottom and realizes there's no way out but up with treatment and rehabilitation, they'll usually take it or try to. And a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people genuinely come into rehab with the good intentions, but while in rehab, that desire for drugs becomes stronger, and they will relapse. I see a lot of relapse.
So
Yeah,
I
they
was,
really need um, something to keep them busy and keep their mind off from drugs.
yeah.
That's where a program like athletes addicts to athletes can be really helpful, because it gives them some positive things to do.
Yeah.
So they're not thinking about getting high.
And being around
Exactly.
people that are not getting high but are getting well.
Exactly.
A support system is very important for a person's rehabilitation, be it family, be it friends, be it a program like Red Pines on the reservation, or Addict to Athletes, or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
They need a new circle of support than
Yeah.
what they've had when they were using drugs.
You bring up a good point there. And you mentioned drug court. I'm really familiar with the drug court system. That's where Addict Athlete kind of started in a program that supported drug court at the county down here in Utah County when I worked for the Division of Substance Abuse. We had a drug court right next to our building. And so the thing that I noticed is that the judge became so familiar with these folks that the defenders and the prosecutor became so they it was interesting because it came a team in and of itself. And so as I watched the folks that really took advantage of this, the ones that thought, okay, I want this abeyance to go away, I'm going to do it all, that stuck in, I watched not just the attorneys kind of like start to understand these folks. I watched the judges get into places they've never really seen before, like this longevity of relationship where they can see this progress. Um, it is amazing to see what happens when we kind of run the gamut, so to speak, with some of these folks, where it's not just a one and done. You did the crime, do the time, but now it's like I want to know. And when the prosecutors and the defenders and the judges start seeing the good in these people and the progress they make, oh my gosh, I've seen I've seen people completely turn their lives around because they're like, wait a minute, these are people that shouldn't care about me that do. Do you guys notice that too in the long run?
Sure. I can only comment on Alabama's drug court system,
Mm-hmm.
specifically Jefferson County, but that is a system of people to help someone get off drugs, stay off drugs, and realize the consequences. And like
Mm-hmm.
you said, the judge gets to know the people. In Alabama, it's a 6 or 12 month program, depending on the addiction levels.
Yeah.
In a 6 month program, they have to go back to the court every week to be tested and look at the judge in the eye and say, I'm still using or I'm not using. And the judge takes a genuine interest in their sobriety and their rehabilitation. And
I,
that's
I
very
was
important.
one of the founding members of the drug court in Vermont. I was the
Ah.
lead public defender on Vermont's drug court, and it did a great job. And it was a system of rewards and sanctions,
Yeah.
um, and it was really designed for younger people,
Yeah.
not so much people in their from mid 30s up. It's not they generally didn't get into the program. It was mainly
Mm-hmm.
for young people there. And the way they balanced the sanctions and rewards, what I found the most interesting thing is before we actually went into session, as Wilson put it, there was a team, and it
Yeah.
was addiction counselors, the judge, the prosecutor, defense attorney, probation, and we would all talk on equal footing as
Wow.
to how this person is doing and what are we going to do. And there was a probation officer who I got to be pretty good friends with, and we used to joke that we were the best of enemies. But I can think of times where I was recommending a weekend in jail for my client based on what they did, and he was saying no, they don't need to go to jail.
I've done that
Yeah.
also.
Wow.
It's like right now, Stephen and I are both advocates for our position. Steve is a
Yeah.
prosecutor, I'm a defense attorney. And
Exactly.
we still talk together. We look for ways to help somebody first without just incarceration.
I
So,
love it. I love it though. And that, listeners, if you think about it, how great would that system be if we approach this kind of stuff that way too, where like I may disagree with you, but I understand where you're coming
oh,
from, so I'm gonna support that or
no,
not.
Stephen and I disagree with each other often,
You'd have
but
to. Yeah.
and sometimes the judge has to make the final decision. But
Yeah.
still, it's a respectful disagreement because I know that Stephen is genuinely trying to do what he thinks is best. I'm trying to do what I think is best, and then we may disagree and go to the judge, and the judge will do what he wants to do. But no, it's got to be a good system.
I love it. That's why I'm so glad you're both here, is because I was going to ask you about that. Like, at the end of the day, how hard is it not to have a chip on your shoulder? Because you're both advocating, believe it or not, listeners, they're both advocating for the person, in the chair, so to speak. And so how in the world do you guys do that? Again, like saying, hey, I understand, I get it,
I
but
think I'd call it professionalism. I'd call it
beautiful,
Steve's a professional. I'm a professional.
We
You,
don't
beautiful.
take it personally.
yeah. So
It's
that,
um, I, I take no pleasure in sending someone to jail.
Of
I
course.
really don't. But in some situations, I have to.
Yeah,
I
We'll
I would
have
take
the
agree.
community to answer to.
Yeah, I don't
Hmm.
do a celebration dance when I get somebody off that probably should go to jail. But still, it's just our jobs. Steve does
Hmm.
his job. I do my job. Um, the probation officers, the drug counselors do their job, and
Yeah,
the judge does his job. And that's just, as long as the system is professional. And our court system right now, where we are both, is becoming the one of the best systems in the entire country.
I
It
believe it.
still has a ways to go, Stephen. I think you'll agree with that. We need to have a wellness court. We need to have a drug court formally started. But programs like Addict to Athletes is a great one, and it's now part of the system.
Well, and I wanted to ask you
We're
guys
headed
about
that
that.
way with the
You're
drug
seeing it.
court.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Stephen. You're seeing it?
I'm seeing it to a point. We have the framework for a wellness court, drug court established. We haven't adopted it formally yet,
Mm-hmm.
but it's in the works. Things move slowly in
Yeah.
the legal system and in the tribal justice system. We also have custom and tradition to take into consideration as
True.
well, and um, that provides another aspect to the program that we have to be careful with. Um,
Mm-hmm.
we've had one of the biggest issues on the reservation is domestic violence,
Yeah.
and we're hope we're hopefully after the first of the year we're going to be having a gentleman come down to train some of our folks in a domestic violence program that he runs, and his for folks that graduate his program, the recidivism rate is about 1%.
Wow. That's
But
incredible.
domestic violence is, in fact, a result of drug use, oftentimes.
Most
Mm-hmm.
of the time, most of the time, domestic violence comes from either alcohol or worse, a combination of meth and alcohol.
Yeah.
There's no excuse for domestic violence, none. It
No.
affects children, it affects the spouse. There's no excuse for it, but it's caused oftentimes by drugs or alcohol.
See, and that's the thing, and listeners, that's why when you guys understand some of the processes behind this, the whole goal here, and Wilson, I'm curious because again, there are some folks out there that need a place to blame to shift the blame. The beauty would be that there'd be this line of like accountability, and sometimes that happens a lot later on down the line. But I love what you guys are talking about because ultimately you do what you have to do. Stephen does what he has to do. The judge does what he has to do. And it's up to the person in that chair that says, now, am I going to make these changes? They have to come from somewhere inside. You can either help them, to a point where they can maybe shift the consequence from jail to treatment or something like that. Or, they can be sent to jail, but you can find sobriety absolutely anywhere. You don't have to. I'm a firm believer that if you truly want it, you can find it under a rock too. So I mean, there are places even in jail. I had a gal come up to me just recently, and she was doing a paper. Which is a better outcome for sobriety, jail or rehab? I think to be true, if we were going to talk about it's an individualized thing, right? The person has to want it. You can find it either place. Um, what do you guys think about that? Like, jail has its own kind of like sober moments, obviously, but it's up to the person, don't you think?
Uh, of course, again, in Alabama, that's where I can mostly speak to. Unfortunately, prisons are a great source of drug use. In Alabama
Ah,
prisons,
yeah,
drugs are prevalent in Alabama prisons. Jails, not so much, but in Alabama prisons. I haven't found that here in the Utah area, but
I'm sure.
a person can become sober wherever they are as long as they decide to do it. They have to be accountable and responsible for their own actions.
There are also, though, I find there needs to be help. There needs to be
Yeah,
qualified, trained help, and that's where a lot of systems are lacking.
yeah,
If you take
yeah,
someone who's an addict and just lock them up, chances are they're going to use again when they come out, unless they've really got it made the decisions not to do it again. But that that I find rarely happens. The people that really do well are the ones that get the treatment, the professional treatment, Some jails offer it, other jails don't, and
Mhm.
that's a fairly significant issue.
And we're lucky on our reservation to have a thing called Red Pines, which is
Mhm.
an excellent rehabilitation program, and that's
Yeah.
resident 60-day residential program where a person goes through the training and the treatment. And then we have something called ASAP, which is an
Hmm.
outpatient program where they receive counseling for certain things. So there are some programs already in place, but the Addict athletes is a great
Yeah.
new addition to the
Well,
toolbox.
thank you. How important is that? Because again, I would say that if you guys, let's say Wilson, that you're really advocating and they look at doing treatment, if you're going to advocate that and they take it, those on the receiving ends, those treatment centers, they've got to be ready. They've got to have obviously the credentials, the experience, the abilities to carry that out. Because I would imagine that at that point, where it's like, hey, either you're going to sink or swim, when you hand that person off to a treatment program, they've got to be on the point because really you guys now are waiting for their report to say, yay, they're doing it, nay, they're not. Um, I would imagine that even that's kind of like, hey guys, make sure that you guys are on top of your game because this
Yeah.
person needs your help.
That's true. And correctly, the prosecutor will say, let me see the report before we decide on the final outcome of the case.
Hmm.
Because professionals can give us insights and can give the court insights into a person's state of mind and willingness to remain sober. And so I believe that in our case, the prosecutor is willing to listen to the experts when appropriate.
Yeah. Well, then, okay, I'm gonna play devil's advocate because I've seen this happen before. Obviously, I've been on, I'm on that level. I'm a therapist working with that. What happens when they're trying to paint the picture that things are a little better than they are because you're looking at it from an outside perspective, also of like, hey, wait a second, they've missed two UAs. The last one was the dilute. You say they're doing well. You know what I'm saying? Like, at what point do you get to teach those guys at the same point? Like, I know that your heart's there, but I need you to also look at the paper. Like, they're not on paper. It doesn't look like they're putting it in. I mean, each case by case, but do they listen to you as well? Like, yeah, I can see your point. Like, I want this guy to succeed probably more than he does, so to speak, right? Does that ever
Right.
come into play?
Sure, of course it does. I see the potential in people, but I also
Mhm.
see the family unit is a
Yes.
360-degree approach that they should be taking because drug use, addictions destroys families just like it
Mhm.
does the individual. And so the counseling program should be including family units as part of the solution,
You're
not the
right.
problem.
You're
I
right.
don't
How often does that happen though? Because again, I own my own treatment center, and just by nature of location and stuff, it was hard to get families up there. But that is a crucial thing. That's why when Addict to Athlete, when we started, and we started seeing these families bringing their kids to these meetings because the conversations are safe. There's no swearing. There's not a lot of like garbage and shenanigans. To me, that was like an honor. I'm like, wow, they're bringing their families. That is kind of the goal here, is it not? To like put this person back into the system by which they can feel the measure of what they're doing this for, which is relationships, right? I mean, get the family back in order.
So that
You
that
have to
that
think about that.
that presumes that the family understands and aren't
Yep.
users themselves.
Oh, yeah.
I find that frequently when young people come into the system, their parents have been there for 20 or 30 years.
Mm,
Uh, a lot of these behaviors are learned.
yeah.
Um, and kids see their parents, and it could be the parents just drink, but the kids see the results of that and they want to try something else.
Mm-hmm.
uh,
And there's a lot of peer
Mm,
pressure. I mean, right now, unfortunately, in our school systems, especially high schools, there's a lot of peer pressure to use drugs because people say it's cool. Well, it's cool until you're addicted,
yeah.
and then you're on the street or in the gutter or not having a good life.
They never
So,
forecast that far. So
nope.
you guys are seeing some of that stuff. Now you mentioned something too, Wilson, that I want to get your guys' thoughts on. Obviously, you know, and I'm not saying that it's any better, any less, or any worse. But the thing is there are some substances such as like THC that we've recently been able to pass with medical use and things of that nature. I see the benefit of it. You'd have asked me this 10 years ago, 20 years, I've been like, no way, abstinence or nothing. But I've seen now some benefits in these things. But what we're seeing now with things like fentanyl and the stuff that's like really scary that could take you out in as little as one dose. Um, I want how do you guys project some of that stuff? Because I think that there are some things where you understand, but then there's like no, there can be no tolerance for something like that. I mean, I know each case is so different, but we're going to see more and more of that as it's coming up. I mean, I have friends down in Arizona who are on the lines down there, and it is ravaging their communities. How do you get ahead of this kind of stuff? Are you seeing it right now? What's your take on it?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing it. Luckily, we have a law enforcement agency on the post that looks for it too,
Good.
and they're fighting the drug problem as well in a positive way. Our law enforcement officials are trying their best to help people, not just arrest them and lock them up. Stephen, what do you think?
Um, yeah. Um, Let me gather my thoughts here for a second. Um, Fentanyl is it is obviously it is an extremely dangerous drug, and it's present in the bulk of the heroin that's in circulation these days.
Mm.
One thing I take into consideration is if someone is caught with the personal use quantity, they may not know there's fentanyl in it.
Mm.
That's one of the scary things
Yeah.
for people that are using, because if that product isn't mixed thoroughly, that there become what are known as hot spots, where there's a little bit of fentanyl that hasn't been mixed in, and they can look at what's their normal amount to take and
Hmm.
find themselves dead, or needing Narcan to be brought back. And
Yeah.
actually, let me get on Narcan just for a moment.
Please do.
There is a push these days to ensure that police officers carry Narcan with them. I fully support that. In California, the governor is about to mandate that high schools have Narcan
Mm.
available, and there's a lot of places, and I would probably go along with this. Is um, uh, Make Narcan an available over-the-counter drug, not necessarily requiring a prescription.
At
Uh,
the,
Mm.
the recent Addict to Athletes banquet that I was
Yeah.
privileged to attend, there was a table giving away Narcan to anybody that signed up. I mean,
Hmm.
we need more Narcan, not less. More.
Exactly. Exactly. So, with that approach, then, guys, because and I'd love both your opinions, even your personal ones. Um, Harm reduction techniques and tools. Some people are so afraid of it. They hear President Biden's announcement that they're going to start doing some harm reduction things, make it more available. You get some old time thingers that think no, abstinence or nothing. What are your guys' thoughts on what we're seeing now with harm reduction versus maybe the old school frame of mind of like abstinence or the highway there?
Abstinence or nothing doesn't work.
Thank you,
We've
Stephen.
tried it. We have tried it for years. The whole war on drugs concept doesn't work.
Yeah.
Um, Needle exchanges are one form of harm reduction, and while the concept of giving out needles to addicts kind of rubs me the wrong way, the flip side is they're sharing needles, potentially spreading AIDS and hepatitis. Um,
Hmm.
it's a very difficult societal question. But in New York, for example, if someone signs up for a needle exchange, they get a card, and they can't be charged with possession of a hypodermic needle if they
Mm.
have their needle exchange card. And it's not to encourage drug use. they're going to use anyway. But it
Exactly.
reduced the harm that comes from sharing needles, using dirty needles. I can think of 3 people that I know that came close to dying from using dirty needles and developing abscesses in their various parts inside their body. Three
Mm.
3 of them in a year. One
Wow.
of them I was a neighbor of mine. I took to the hospital. I didn't know what was going on. He was just really sick. And according to the docs, he was within 6 hours of dying
Oh my
from this
gosh.
infection he got from using dirty needles.
Mm.
I personally cannot condone needle exchanges or the use of things like that, but I understand it. And like Steve said, I would rather someone uh, remain living than using a dirty needle or
Yeah.
heroin injection. But still, it's not something I don't think society should encourage because it seems to encourage drug use.
Yeah.
Uh, I know that medical marijuana is now a big trend, but social marijuana is as much of a gateway drug as is cigarettes and alcohol.
Hmm.
But I just don't think society should condone it.
Yeah. Well, it makes a lot of sense, and that's why I love you guys to be able to like share even your personal thoughts because I'm much the same way. Like I wish we didn't have to have something like that, and that just kind of furthers my own goal to help these folks get down to the core of why they're using. Because you both know that drug use is a symptom of something deeper, and if we can find the source of that something deeper, we can help them not have to use that substance as a coping mechanism.
Well, but let me say this too. I mean, yes,
Hmm.
uh, once they start using, it's a disease. I believe,
Yeah,
like alcohol.
yeah, absolutely,
What
it can
caused
be.
them to first start using? We need to address that issue, of
Yep.
course. Schools, high schools, family issues.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm with you. So we're almost out of time here, gentlemen. But I do want to ask you this question: if you both, if you and you can answer your own ways. If you both were going to begin a process and maybe put in your chips to like say, hey, this is how I would love to see all of this take place from the initial contact with law enforcement to the end of like the treatment process. What would you love to see have happen if you could build the system? What would be your foundations?
It. I'll go
Hmm.
first, Steve, and then you can answer. But in my mind, it's a from start to finish process. Law enforcement recognizes that someone is an addict and a user. They get into the system knowing they're an
Yeah.
addict. The judicial system identifies them as a user and begins looking for programs that a person can get into and try to determine what can get them sober.
Yeah.
And then
I
after they
love it.
become sober,
Love it. Stephen,
what
what do you
can
think?
keep them sober?
I'm pretty much
Be
along the
it
same
church,
lines
be
as
it
what Wilson said,
society,
is that
whatever.
recognize
It
it
needs something to
as a
focus on besides
disease.
drugs.
Now, that's not to
And
say
it
that
would be a
somebody who smokes
A
weed,
to Z
once a
effort
week has a
in my mind.
disease.
Hmm.
There's got to be some common sense applied to it.
For sure.
Um, and as a prosecutor, I have seen hundreds of violent crimes committed because of alcohol. I I have never seen a violent crime committed because of marijuana other than maybe somebody beating up a bag of Doritos.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I
I hear
find
you.
marijuana to be a far less dangerous drug than alcohol. And alcohol tends to be at the root of almost every drug problem I've seen.
Yeah.
Um, I don't see marijuana so much that way, but alcohol lowers your
I agree
inhibitions
with that.
and makes somebody open to trying something different.
Mm.
I mean, if I had my way, marijuana would be completely legal and alcohol would be far more restricted than it is now.
Makes perfect sense. So, here yesterday we were doing this thing, we call it our Project Elf, and it's our Sub for Santa thing. We spend lots of time throughout the year collecting money and donations so that at this point, with people that have fallen back, maybe they have court fines and low employment, they're in treatment, they don't have money, we can supply Christmas for their families. And yesterday, something amazing happened. For about the last couple of years, we bumped into a law enforcement officer, Officer Johnson here for the Orem Police Department. And we were doing a run. It was a public run with Addict Athlete. It was called the Chase a Crook Out of Town run. It was hilarious, right? The Orem Police Department put this on, and then all of us come walking on Addict Athlete. They're like, "Ooh, who are these folks?" And we built a great relationship with Orem law enforcement, so much so that Officer Johnson noticed one of my athletes, her name was Janelle, as her being her arresting officer. And they came over and had a conversation, and Officer Johnson now got to see Janelle on the other side of this. And you guys, this connection these two have made was huge. I had Janelle on this podcast. Officer Johnson heard it. She says, I never really understood that side of your story. Yesterday, Officer Johnson and another officer pulled in with their SUVs full of toys to donate to these folks who are in recovery. And when I watched that link, I was blown away, and I thought, I'm going to add to your guys' foundations of what you would want. Those arresting officers, they don't realize how influential that first encounter can be. I've watched Janelle lean on Officer Johnson now even post all this, and they have the most amazing relationship. So it's like, I get that like all these cops, they don't have enough time to do that with everybody, but I'm telling you, the ones that kind of like keep a mind's eye, it's incredible what can happen, because then that person's like, hey, I get why it happened. You understand why I had to come on board. The attorneys are the same way, the judge is the same way, the therapy is the same way, to where, again, like what we do on Team Addict Athlete is building a strong home team. So in your home team, right, you have your family system, you know which position you play. Maybe the referees are some of the law enforcement and legal systems. And then you have like the general managers, which is probably like, maybe even God. I don't know whoever you put it in there. But I love what you guys are saying, because that's what it's all about, listeners. It's about all of us doing our own respective jobs to help you overcome this stuff. Now, in a utopian world, that'd look great start to finish. There will be some that take it and some that don't. But final thoughts, Wilson. What is your forecast on this? What gets you up so you don't like throw in the towel and say to heck with us all? Mm-hmm.
First of all, it's got to be up to the individual. The system can't fix somebody unless they're willing to be fixed, if that's the right term. I see good things ahead. I see programs developing and being put into place for treatment and rehabilitation and sobriety more than simply jail and prisons.
What do you think?
So I'm encouraged.
Again, I'm pretty much on the same line. We're recognizing
better, I think.
We're recognizing
more avenues
that
for them to get help.
addiction is a disease.
That's what I think.
I think our priorities could be rearranged a little bit, and with more focus put on specifically on the drugs that are causing the biggest problems. I encourage our officers, for example, if someone has a small amount of marijuana on them, don't spend too much time with it. You have discretion as an officer whether you're going to bring a charge or not. Let's focus our efforts on meth and on heroin and on violent crimes. So from a law enforcement side, I support focusing our efforts on the areas that cause the most harm. It's all about harm reduction and protecting the community. And a gram of weed is not a threat to the community. A gram of meth is. A gram of heroin is. So if and we're limited in our resources. We're pretty lucky on the Ute Reservation in that our police force seems to be about the right size to manage the reservation. But when I was in Wyoming on the Wind River Reservation, our police force was about the same size as here, and our population was 10 times greater. And we had, on a Monday morning, I would have 15 to 20 people sitting in the dock who had been arrested over the weekend. And here, sometimes we'll go a whole weekend without one arrest. So
Mm-hmm.
we're which puts us in a really good spot to focus our efforts on the things that we can fix, the
I love
addictions
it.
that we can fix. So there may be some police officers who have the attitude, okay, it's illegal, you're getting charged. Um, but there are some that are starting to really get it and see it as a disease, not a crime, or a disease and a crime, but the
Yeah.
disease comes first, and we can
Mm.
and they will help us focus our efforts on getting that person better rather than just locking them up.
I love it. I love it. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. We've never had anything like this on the podcast, and I know that it's going to be very beneficial for our listeners to hear both sides because again, it's to a degree polar opposites at the same time, same team, which I absolutely love. So thank you for carving out some time. Um, I think out there in the basin, you guys, you're in good hands, and again, that doesn't give you the go ahead, all you basinites, to go out there and break the law, but just know that you could even preemptively strike this by getting help. And if you need anything, I'm sure these guys would be more than happy to point you in the right direction. And that's what these community resources are
Absolutely.
all about. So thank you so much for your time, guys. Athletes, you've been well fed. Continue to reach out, support your teammates, check on them as we go through the holidays. And athletes, until next time, please turn your mess into a message.